The psychology of transformation. Why you had to die to become who you are. Have you ever looked at an old photograph of yourself and felt like you were staring at a complete stranger? The smile looks vaguely familiar, but the eyes seem different. Softer perhaps, maybe more naive, more trusting than they have any right to be. You can almost feel the silence between the moments that photograph captured. The laughter that used to flow effortlessly without effort or pretense. The confidence that hadn't yet been scarred by betrayal or disappointment. And in that quiet realization, something inside you whispers a truth you can't ignore. I'm not that person anymore. But here's the question that haunts you in the stillness. If you're not who you were, then who are you now? And more unsettling, who did you have to become in order to survive? Change doesn't happen the way stories and movies tell it. It doesn't arrive with thunder, revelation, or sudden enlightenment. It comes in whispers, in the pauses between difficult decisions, in the tired sighs you let out without meaning to, without even noticing. It's there in the way you stop chasing certain people who no longer deserve your energy, the way you no longer feel compelled to explain yourself the same way you used to, the way your silence gradually starts to mean peace instead of defeat or resignation. Transformation is not an explosion. It's erosion. Slow, patient, invisible to everyone around you, but as steady and relentless as the tide gradually wearing down the shore. Today, we're going to explore the psychology of personal transformation, the death of your old self, and the often painful rebirth into who you're becoming. This isn't just philosophy or spiritual metaphor. This is neuroscience, psychology, and the lived experience of every person who has ever had to burn down their entire identity just to survive. By the end, you'll understand why transformation feels like dying, why the world resists your evolution, and why the loneliest part of growth is often the most necessary. Let's begin where all transformation secretly starts, in childhood, where you first learn to disappear. The childhood self that learned to disappear. Imagine a young child walking carefully across a creaking wooden floor, holding their breath so the house stays quiet. They've learned through painful experience that silence keeps the storm away. They've learned to read the emotional weather in the faces of the people who are supposed to protect them. Every frown becomes a warning. Every sigh becomes a threat. Every slammed door becomes a code they must decipher to stay safe. And somewhere in that constant decoding, in that hypervigilant monitoring of other people's emotions, they begin to disappear. You were that child once, or someone remarkably similar. You learned early, perhaps too early, that love wasn't unconditional. It was earned through performance, through being good, through not causing problems. So you began shaping yourself like clay, smoothing out the parts that got you in trouble, carefully hiding the aspects that drew too much attention or made adults uncomfortable. You learned to smile even when it hurt, to agree even when you didn't, to become agreeable, useful, small, manageable, because safety lived inside approval. You didn't know it then, but each small compromise, each moment of self-betrayal, was laying the foundation of a mask that would follow you into adulthood like a shadow you can't shake. Psychologists call this the birth of the false self, a concept developed by British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. It's not a character flaw or weakness. It's a survival mechanism, a necessary adaptation to an environment that didn't feel safe enough for authenticity. According to attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, a child will choose attachment over authenticity every single time. Because to a child, love literally means survival. The child who senses emotional neglect, inconsistent affection, or volatile reactions learns to perform, to mirror what others need, to suppress what they genuinely feel. The nervous system itself adapts to this reality. Stress hormone cortisol spikes become normalized. Empathy sharpens as a survival tool. Intuition becomes hypervigilant, always scanning for danger. You didn't just learn to survive emotionally. Your biology learned too, but the cost of becoming loved is often becoming lost. You grew up fluent in reading the emotions of others, yet somehow illiterate in your own. You could predict your parents' moods with uncanny accuracy, but struggled to name your own fears. You could comfort friends, but had no idea how to comfort yourself. And so, piece by piece, the authentic self, the one who felt freely and spoke boldly, went underground, buried beneath accumulating layers of adaptation, performance, and learned helplessness. Years later, you might call it people-pleasing, perfectionism, chronic burnout, or crippling self-doubt. But beneath those modern labels lives the same child, still whispering the same desperate question. Will I still be loved if I stop performing? Will I still be safe if I show who I really am? The world doesn't teach you how to answer that question. It only teaches you how to keep pretending, how to maintain the performance indefinitely. And yet transformation never begins with pretending. It begins with breaking, with the moment your carefully constructed identity finally collapses under its own unbearable weight. Living behind the mask you call adulthood, somewhere along the journey from childhood to adulthood, you stopped asking, "Who am I?" and started asking, "Who do I need to be?" That's how adult life begins for most people. Not as a celebration of freedom and autonomy, but as a quiet continuation of the childhood performance you perfected years ago. Only now the stage is larger, the stakes feel higher, and the audience seems to be everywhere, watching, judging, evaluating your every move. You wake up each day and carefully select your mask. For some, it's the achiever, efficient, competent, tireless, earning love and worth through relentless success. For others, it's the caretaker, kind, selfless, endlessly available, mistaking complete exhaustion for virtue. Or perhaps it's the stoic, unreadable, emotionally composed, seemingly immune to pain, convinced that feelings are dangerous liabilities that must be controlled at all costs. Whatever form your particular mask takes, it becomes your second skin, a costume carefully stitched together from expectations. Society's expectations, your family's expectations, your own internalized expectations. And soon, you forget that you were ever naked underneath it all. Carl Jung called this the persona, the social face we present to the world, carefully crafted to survive within its unspoken rules. It's not inherently false or bad. In fact, it's psychologically necessary. We need personas to navigate civilization, to play our assigned roles, to protect our deepest vulnerabilities from a world that doesn't always feel safe. But the danger lies in a subtle shift, mistaking the mask for your actual face, believing that the performance is who you truly are at your core. When that happens, life becomes pure theater. You laugh on cue, love on cue, even break down on cue when it's socially appropriate. Every emotion becomes rehearsed, every moment of silence carefully curated for effect. You don't live, you perform. And beneath the applause and approval, something aches. Something knows this isn't real. Because the longer you wear the mask without question, the heavier it becomes. It starts as protective armor but slowly transforms into a suffocating cage. You begin to sense the profound difference between being admired and being genuinely seen, between being respected and being truly understood. Neuroscientists studying reward systems might explain that your brain has grown addicted to external validation. Dopamine releases from approval reinforce the same neural loops that once made you feel safe as a child. But psychologically, it feels much simpler and more painful. You've built a beautiful prison and called it success. There are moments, quiet and fleeting, when the mask inevitably slips. Maybe during heartbreak, maybe in solitude, maybe in the strange stillness of early morning when you wake up and realize with sudden clarity that you no longer recognize the voice inside your own head. Those are the cracks in your constructed identity. Brief glimpses of the authentic self buried beneath accumulating layers of adaptation and performance. And if you listen closely during those moments, really listen, you'll hear it. The faint but persistent pulse of authenticity waiting patiently to be remembered. How the brain learns to become someone else change feels mystical and spiritual when you're living through it. like your soul is literally shedding its skin. But underneath the poetry and metaphor, there's fascinating science quietly unfolding. Every time you repeat a thought, every time you react the same habitual way, every time you choose familiar comfort over uncertain courage, your brain is carefully taking notes. It's building neural highways of habit, carving deep grooves in your psychological landscape. And over months and years, those grooves become something far more significant than habit. They become identity. You don't just have recurring thoughts. You are the patterns that repeat inside you. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself based on experience and repetition. The principle is elegantly simple. What fires together, wires together. This means if you spend 10 years consistently believing you're fundamentally unworthy or broken, your neurons have rehearsed that story into biological permanence. They've literally built neural pathways that sing that narrative automatically, unconsciously. It's not personal weakness when you struggle to change deeply ingrained patterns. It's biology. You're fighting against a machine you unknowingly programmed over years or decades. But here's the miraculous part that neuroscience has confirmed. The same brain that learned fear, unworthiness, and self-betrayal can learn freedom, confidence, and self-trust. Studies on cognitive restructuring and neuroplasticity demonstrate that with conscious effort, emotional reflection, and patient repetition, the brain begins to prune old, unused pathways and actively grow new ones. Just like muscles that strengthen with use, thought patterns solidify with practice. Each time you pause before automatically reacting, each time you consciously question an old limiting belief, each time you sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately escaping them, you're teaching your brain a new language, a new way of being, a new self. Psychologists describe identity as a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Your beliefs shape your behavior, and your behavior continuously reinforces those same beliefs. Break one side of that loop, and the entire cycle begins to shift and transform. That's why genuine change doesn't begin with motivation or willpower. It begins with awareness, with seeing the pattern clearly for the first time. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote something profound. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. That space, that brief pause, is neuroplasticity in motion. The tiny moment where the old story can finally change. And yet neuroscience alone cannot fully explain the deep ache of transformation. Carl Jung believed that the psyche's evolution requires integration, the conscious confrontation with what you've repressed and denied. To truly change, you must face the emotional truths buried in your unconscious. Without that confrontation, change remains superficial, an intellectual concept rather than an embodied experience. Modern trauma research strongly echoes this understanding. When difficult emotions are fully processed and reintegrated rather than avoided or suppressed, the nervous system literally recalibrates. The past stops looping endlessly. The body stops unconsciously bracing for danger, and the mind begins to trust its own capacity for calm. So perhaps the brain is more than just a biological organ. It's a storyteller, one that has told the same narrative for so long that it's forgotten there are blank pages ahead, new chapters waiting to be written. Change begins not when you invent an entirely new story, but when you stop believing that every chapter before this one was final and unchangeable. The night the old self begins to die, there comes a moment in every genuine transformation when everything you once were begins to collapse. It doesn't happen with dramatic fireworks or sudden revelation. It happens in silence, the kind that hums behind closed doors and sinks deep into your bones. You wake one day and realize with quiet horror that the world that used to fit you perfectly now feels impossibly small, like a room whose walls are slowly inching closer every time you take a breath. The conversations that once sparked genuine joy now sound hollow and performative. The relationships that once defined your entire identity feel foreign and unfamiliar. Even your own reflection in the mirror seems like the ghost of someone you used to know intimately but can barely recognize now. This is what mystics and spiritual teachers call the dark night of the soul, the quiet death of who you thought you were. It isn't depression in the clinical sense, though it often mimics it closely. It's a spiritual undoing, the systematic disintegration of identity, the loss of the false self you've worn for so long that you forgot it was ever a disguise. Psychologists might describe it as ego death, the mind's desperate attempt to hold on to its familiar stories while the deeper self demands liberation at any cost. You can feel it viscerally in your nervous system, that trembling confusion, the strange mix of grief and relief happening simultaneously, like mourning your own shadow while celebrating its disappearance. The brain, evolutionarily wired for stability and predictability, panics when it senses internal collapse. It floods you with fear and paralyzing doubt, convincing you that you're falling apart, that something is terribly wrong. But in truth, you're not falling apart. You're being carefully dismantled so something new and more authentic can take shape. Neuroscientists who study trauma integration describe this process as neural pruning, old connections dissolving to make space for new ones. What feels like pure destruction is actually creation in disguise. You're not losing yourself. You're shedding what was never truly you to begin with. Imagine a garden in the dead of winter. The soil looks barren, lifeless, seemingly forgotten by nature. But beneath the surface, unseen roots are quietly rearranging themselves, preparing for growth you can't yet perceive. That's what this season of darkness actually is, the quiet reconstruction of your inner world happening beneath conscious awareness. You'll feel like you're disappearing because, in a very real way, you are. The version of you built entirely on external approval, desperate control, or chronic fear is dissolving. And that dissolution hurts deeply. The applause fades. The noise dies down. Silence becomes your only witness. But maybe your sadness isn't failure or regression. Maybe it's your soul finally outgrowing its old cage. Maybe the emptiness you feel is not a void to be feared, but a doorway to walk through. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once wrote, "The soul is dyed by the color of its thoughts." Perhaps yours is simply changing hue, transforming into something you haven't seen before. The world will tell you to move on quickly, to fill the silence immediately, to distract yourself with new beginnings and fresh starts. But real transformation doesn't rush. It lingers intentionally in the ruins. Because before something inside you can be authentically born again, something else must first be allowed to die completely. Why the world resists your evolution? Have you ever noticed how the world applauds you enthusiastically when you stay exactly the same, but grows strangely silent the moment you begin to change? Society has a peculiar affection for consistency and predictability. It wants you to be understandable, categorizable, easy to place in neat boxes. Be reliable, they say. Be stable. Don't change too much. But what they really mean is, don't evolve too far beyond our collective comfort zone. Because the moment you start genuinely transforming, you threaten the fragile social order that keeps everyone pretending they're content with stagnation. From early childhood, you're taught that identity is something to protect and maintain, not something to question or evolve. You choose a career path and are told to stick to it for decades. You fall in love and are told to never change too much or grow apart. Even your friends, the ones who claim they want the best for you, can become deeply unsettled when you start to outgrow the role they're used to. You were the quiet one, the funny one, the reliable one, but now you're something else entirely, uncertain, introspective, becoming. And that terrifies them because your transformation exposes the stagnation they've learned to justify in their own lives. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith. the act of living in systematic self-deception, pretending that we're fixed entities instead of beings in constant motion and evolution. To admit that we can fundamentally change would mean admitting that everything we consider stable might be temporary. Marriages, beliefs, social hierarchies, even our sense of self. So society builds elaborate cages of identity and rewards you generously for staying inside them. The employee who stays 20 years in the same unfulfilling job is called loyal. The one who leaves to pursue growth is called reckless or unstable. The partner who sacrifices personal growth for relationship comfort is called devoted. The one who evolves beyond what the relationship can hold is called selfish or unfaithful. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the tragedy of becoming. He believed that humans fear evolution because it demands the death of certainty. To grow is to let go of what once made perfect sense, to stand in the uncomfortable chaos between who you were and who you're becoming. But culture doesn't celebrate chaos or uncertainty. It medicates it. It teaches you to suppress your metamorphosis with distractions, rigid routines, and applause for conformity. And yet somewhere deep within, your spirit aches for more. You feel it when your ambitions no longer fit your current surroundings, when your conversations begin to sound rehearsed and hollow, when you sense that life is quietly asking you to move forward, but you stay still because no one else around you is moving. Transformation in this context becomes rebellion. You become like a butterfly returning to a world that still expects and demands a caterpillar. They see your wings as arrogance, your silence as distance, your growth as betrayal. But what they cannot understand is that change was never an act of defiance against them. It was survival. It was choosing to live authentically rather than die slowly inside a life that no longer fits. The quiet loneliness of becoming no one warns you that transformation is profoundly lonely. They speak of growth as enlightenment and liberation, but never mention the emptiness that follows. When you begin to shed old identities and familiar patterns, it doesn't feel like the freedom everyone promised. It feels like mourning, like grief for a life you can't return to. You start walking through a world that no longer fits, surrounded by familiar faces that no longer truly see you. Conversations that once flowed naturally now feel rehearsed and shallow. Laughter feels like an echo from a version of you that's already gone, already buried. And in the silence that replaces it all, you wonder, was this change worth the cost? There's a peculiar kind of grief that accompanies evolution. Psychologists call it identity loss, the emotional fallout that happens when your internal world transforms faster than your external circumstances. Your mind desperately tries to hold on to the past because it confuses familiarity with safety. The neural pathways that once defined your habits, your relationships, your entire sense of self actively resist being rewritten. The brain doesn't crave happiness or fulfillment. It craves what's predictable, what's known. Even if the familiar pattern was toxic, it was yours. And that makes letting go feel like betrayal of yourself. You begin to miss even the wounds that once defined you, the heartbreak that gave you purpose, the chaos that gave you identity. It's strange how pain can feel like home when you've lived in it long enough. This is what Carl Jung meant when he wrote about individuation, the painful separation from the collective illusions that once held you. To become your authentic self is to step away from the comfort of belonging, to walk alone for a while. The loneliness deepens when those around you resist your transformation. Friends pull away, sensing the change but not understanding it. They miss the version of you that was predictable, that made them comfortable, that fit neatly into their world. Growth is a quiet form of rebellion, and not everyone wants a mirror that reflects their own stagnation back at them. And yet, amid the loneliness, something begins to whisper. It's faint but steady, a new rhythm forming beneath the grief. Because there comes a moment when you stop fighting what you're losing and start listening to what's trying to emerge. Rebuilding yourself from the inside out eventually, the storm passes. Not because it weakens, but because you've learned how to stand in it without breaking. The silence that once felt unbearable begins to feel sacred. The loneliness that once hollowed you out transforms into space, room for something new to grow. You realize that transformation was never about erasing your past or pretending it didn't happen. It was about reclaiming what was buried beneath years of performance and fear. This is where genuine rebuilding begins, not from external validation, but from within. It's slow, unglamorous work. There's no applause here, no dramatic moment of rebirth that everyone can witness. Just small choices repeated daily until they become strength. You start setting boundaries, not as walls to hide behind, but as lines of respect drawn clearly in the soil of your soul. You begin to write, not to be understood by others, but to understand yourself. You meet your shadow in quiet moments, noticing the parts of you you once denied and exiled. Anger, desire, fear. And you stop trying to destroy them. You realize they were never enemies. They were messengers. The parts you tried to eliminate were simply asking to be heard and integrated. Psychologists call this integration, the process of reuniting the conscious and unconscious self. It's the healing that happens when you stop fighting your darkness and start learning its language. And in that movement toward wholeness, something miraculous begins to unfold. You start building yourself anew, brick by brick, breath by breath. You discover that stability doesn't mean staying frozen in place. It means being rooted enough to bend without snapping. You were never broken, only rearranged. Transformation is not a makeover. It's a remembering, the child who dreamed freely, the soul that trusted life before it was taught to fear. They're still within you, waiting patiently beneath the rubble. The fire that was always inside you if you look closely at that old photograph again, the one that used to make you ache with loss, something has fundamentally changed. The person staring back no longer feels like a stranger. Their eyes, once naive, now seem gentle, forgiving. You see now that they weren't weak, they were becoming. You realize that every version of yourself, every heartbreak, every collapse was not an ending but a necessary dismantling. Because transformation was never meant to be graceful. It's violent, disorienting, raw, a kind of sacred destruction. The universe itself operates on this rhythm. Stars collapsing to forge new light. Forests burning to make room for new growth. Hearts breaking to remind us that love isn't found, it's revealed. Nietzsche once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." You understand now what he meant. The chaos within you was never your enemy. It was the fire preparing you for flight. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of your shadow, your pain, your potential. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. The phoenix does not rise despite the ashes. It rises because of them. When you begin to live with this awareness, something miraculous happens. You stop fearing the cycles. You no longer panic when things fall apart because you recognize the pattern. Decay is not death. It's the soil of rebirth. And so you breathe. You stop running from the ruins and start building temples out of them. You forgive yourself for the versions that had to die for this one to live. You see that the cracks weren't flaws. They were doorways. You were never meant to stay the same. You were meant to evolve, to fall apart and come together over and over until every fragment of your being remembers its place in the whole. That is the art of sacred destruction. That is the fire that was always inside you, burning, rising, burning again. Not to become someone new, but to remember that even in the ashes, you were always the fire.